really good to have with gouache. I'm wiping my brush off a lot, which when I get into the demo portion, I'll kind of show you what I mean with that. But just like watercolor, you really want some paper towel or like a sponge, something to absorb the water for you. So what gouache is essentially is an opaque watercolor paint. So watercolor is typically very transparent, allowing you to see the white of the paper, and you have to build it up in layers. But gouache, however, it's versatile in the sense that you can wash it or you can water it down and put down washes like watercolor, but you can also apply one coat and have it be very thick and opaque straight off the bat. So actually a lot of illustrators like to use gouache as a paint medium because of that, because you can layer it or you can use it in a single application. The other thing is you can paint dark to light or light to dark with gouache, whereas watercolor, once you put down some darks, I mean, you can sort of glaze and tint things, but it's really hard to change it after that fact. Gouache dries to a matte finish, which is again why illustrators really like to use it, because it scans really nicely, therefore shows up on the computer screen really nicely. You're not going to have to worry about the glossy sheen that acrylic has. And then if you're wondering, I've actually never personally tried acrylic gouache before, but what acrylic gouache is it dries to a matte finish and is opaque like traditional gouache, but it also contains an acrylic binder in it, which makes it water resistant once it's dry. Whereas traditional gouache, you would need to spray and like a matte, you could do a matte or a gloss finish. Matte, obviously, if you want to keep your gouache matte, but you could do a gloss finish if you did want to give it a shine, but you'd have to seal it to protect it. Otherwise, water can keep reactivating it, even once it's dry on paper. But again, that acrylic binder, like acrylic paint, makes it water resistant. So the thing that's really nice about gouache is you actually have more options than watercolor paint for surfaces to paint on. You can paint on wood panels, you can paint on illustration board, you could start with a dark background like black or gray and paint on top of that and have it show, whereas watercolor is not going to show up. So that's kind of some of the advantages of gouache, is that you can do different things. I mean, really, you could paint on canvas with it. I wouldn't see why not, although I really haven't before. I usually stick to wood panel or watercolor paper. And then just to show you, I think it's fun if you happen to have gouache and watercolor, just to do some little samples to kind of see some of the differences between the paints. So these were just some images that I actually just pulled from Google, because of course there's a lot out there. But this is an example, similar subject matter, watercolor versus gouache. So sometimes it's a matter of what you want the finished piece to look like. That's sometimes what I think about when I'm choosing which medium I want to work with, or like which, sort of techniques I want to use. And then this is a watercolor gouache and acrylic example. So you can see similar subject matter, but the differences in the paint once it's dried. So again, the watercolor is kind of a little washy. You can still kind of see through, a little bit more transparent. The gouache, you can kind of get a little bit of both. And acrylic, of course, you can get a little bit of both too, but you're going to have it dry. It's going to have a natural sheen to it. And of course, be, again, water resistant. Well, so I am going to switch to my other screen here, other video. There we go. So as far as gouache goes, if I know some of you said you already have gouache, which is great. Just to show you kind of some of the things I have for gouache. So I really like the Arteza gouache. I actually just have them all in a bin, which I happen to order the really big set with, and like I mentioned last week when we were talking about watercolor, this can be overwhelming. So sometimes it's really nice to start with your primaries. And I mentioned this previously too, but you're typically going to have a warm and a cool of each primary color. I mean, you can start with just one of each, but it is kind of nice to have a warm and a cool of each just to, so you can learn about warming and cooling, because generally speaking, warm colors tend to come toward us, cool colors push back and go and recede in space. So if you're using both warm and cool, you can really create a lot of depth in your compositions. So, but I mean, I'm just pulling all the different reds and blues. I mean, there's so many different ones here, which again, it's really fun to play around with all the different colors. It's definitely good to do swatches of each color. And with gouache, I typically like to do a range, which I'll show you in just a minute, where it's kind of straight from the tube, and then I progressively add more water and get more of a wash look so I can see the range. So these are the Arteza gouaches. I also tried, this is jelly gouache, and this is just from Amazon. This is what this looks like. So they did come with like little seals over top of each of these, which, you know, you peel off and it's jelly. But of course they are starting to dry out a little bit, even with the lid on. I could like spritz them with water, like a little spray bottle or an eyedropper with some water. You could drop that in and sort of re-wet it. It came with this little palette, which just to show you my palette, I never actually wash my gouache palettes off. I always leave them full of paint because you can keep reactivating it. But what Susan was talking about in the beginning, that Stay Wet palette, so that's a palette that actually has like a little sponge in it that you wet, and it has this paper that's designed to keep the paints moist. So that can be a really good thing if you want to keep it continually wet. I did have some gouache that dried out, and I just got little jars, cut open the tubes, put the gouache in the jar and filled it with some water and just kind of mixed it, and you can kind of see it. I mean, it really turned into this kind of neat, it's almost like an India ink, but like super opaque consistency. So just so you know, if you ever have tubes of gouache that dry out, you can cut them open and reactivate them. You don't have to toss them. So, and these, I think this is like at least 12 years old, that gouache. And I reactivated it after that time. And then this is my normal palette. So this is a butcher tray. I have a few of these. I have one for acrylic, one for gouache. The gouache one I never clean off. But just to kind of show you, if I did want to clean off a part because it kind of got dirty or I just needed some more space, I wouldn't clean off the whole thing. I would just take a little bit of paper towel and I just get it a little bit wet, and then you can just kind of wipe off a little portion for yourself. So that's what I do if I need more space and then I've got more space to mix. Because again, gouache is expensive, and you can, or it can be expensive. The Arteza I think is pretty affordable, but you know, if you're getting some of the fancy gouache, is pretty pricey. So it's like you want to save it because you can reactivate it. So I'll kind of show you some of the differences of what it looks like from reactivating versus fresh from the tubes as well. And then I also just have some palette paper here that you can use for really any kind of paint. Again, just so you can see some kind of fresh mixing because my palette is so full. And then this is just watercolor paper, Canson, it's cold press, 140-pound paper. And I've got some water. And then as far as paintbrushes go, I've mentioned this before in classes. I do use my watercolor, gouache, and acrylic. I do share brushes, although I do have some brushes that are specialty watercolor that I kind of save just for watercolor, although the gouache wouldn't hurt it. But to keep it simple, I really like some little rounds. So these are, this is a 4, this is a 6, this is a 7, and then flats. This is a 10 and a flat. So these are just kind of nice, basic to keep it round and flat if you want to keep it simple. But I mean, any brush can work for gouache, of course, just like any other paint. But, you know, sometimes when you're beginning something new, it's nice to limit yourself and not use everything because it can feel a little overwhelming. So I'm just going to pick a few primaries. I'm going to do a scarlet red. I'm just going to use this palette paper. So a little scarlet red, got, deciding what blue I want to do. Yeah, I'm going to do ultramarine blue. A little ultramarine. And then I've got, this is a bumblebee yellow. Arteza has some interesting names for their colors. It sounds like Crayola crayons. There's, usually you could do like a cadmium yellow or a lemon yellow. So lemon yellow is gonna be more cool. To me, this bumblebee yellow, it's not that different. I don't know, I'll try it, why not? So sometimes with primaries, they do mix really well together, and sometimes you'll have to try some other combinations. But usually you're pretty safe with like an ultramarine blue, cadmium red, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, cobalt blue. Most of those hues are going to be good for your general mixing. And I always think it's good to just practice mixing your colors when you're getting started with something. Again, I know you've got all these tubes of colors, which is super fun, but when you're getting into art, it's really nice to learn how to mix your own. I think it's helpful too to have a color wheel. I know a few of you guys do have color wheels, and even just looking online at a color wheel can be helpful, but I just got this from Michael's, and it's just nice because you can slide it around and it'll kind of show you cool versus warm, adding black to get your shades, adding white to get a tint, adding complement to lower intensity. It kind of talks about all those things. You can see your split complementary. So this can just be kind of like a little handy tool to have. And honestly, it's good for all paint mediums, really. And honestly, like color pencil too. It's sometimes good to go back to the color wheel. I find it handy if I'm just not sure what color to use. But just to kind of show you, so I'll just pull some of this red. So usually I just like to pull from the pile a little bit, add a little bit of water in to just kind of mix in to get this ready. So more of a wash, and so this is even with some water added to it. I'll zoom just a little bit so you can see that better. Okay, so adding some, this is with water. So I think it's just kind of, you know, nice to experiment adding water in, and then versus, this is like straight from the tube. My brush is wet, of course, just to move the paint. It's a little bit more fluid, but I don't have a bunch of water mixed into the paint. So just to kind of show you the difference right here. Of course, when you have less water in, you're going to need to dip your brush into the paint more often, and you're going to probably find yourself having to do more strokes to smooth out the paint. That's just, of course, because water helps it flow. So straight from the tube with water. Now I don't believe I have that exact red on my palette that's been dry, but I have a red that's close. So I'm just rinsing off my brush, and I'm going to take some water on my brush. I'm just going to activate this little bit of red that's sitting here. It's mixed in with a little blue, but that's okay. So this is not going to be the same color, but just to kind of show you again what it looks like reactivated from your palette. So from your palette reactivated, it's going to be more like watercolor, a little bit more washy. But you can just kind of keep mixing in the water, and the more you kind of mix in the water and bring your brush over to activate the paint, it will start looking more opaque. So that's that same color. I just spent a little bit more time running my brush through it, reactivating it. So you can get different looks with the paint too. And I'll just show you this too. So this is the Holbein. I never know how to say that properly. But this is the one I reactivated. So I'll just show you what this looks like. So again, I'm just wetting my brush. So I have a little water on my brush, dipping this in. And this is, so it's very liquid, but it's very, very opaque. So you really can't, one coat basically, you really can't see through it. So the thing about gouache to keep in mind is gouache, even on the paper, can be reactivated. So any of these colors, I can put water into them and reactivate them. For example, this one that I took straight from the tube that has, that's a little thicker. If I just have a wet paint brush, and if I run that through here, I can take that paint and just pull it down. So I can reactivate the paint at any time. So what that means when you're painting with gouache is you want to start with light layers and then work to your more opaque layers if you're planning on layering it. If you're planning on painting just one solid coat and not really layering it, you don't have to worry about that too much. But otherwise, you want to begin with washes. So the main difference between gouache and watercolor is in watercolor, you can do what's called glazing, which I talked about last week, where you lay down a color, let it dry, put a wash of another color, put a wash of another color, and let it dry in between. And you can build up all these layers of colors. But if I take a wash of another color over top of some dried gouache, which I can just show you here. See, I'll take some yellow, like I was going to make a wash, and I'll wash it over top of this dried one. And what happens is that wash activates the paint underneath and pulls it back up into my next layer. It does not do that in watercolor the same way. So that can be a really good thing, or it can be a really bad thing. The most important thing is being aware of that and learning how to paint with gouache to use this to your advantage. The advantage of that is you can blend gouache continually, meaning if it dries and you don't like how it's blended, you can reactivate the paint and blend it more. So I'll show you, again, I think painting a sphere is always a good thing to try with the basic paint, just to get a feel for it. So I'm just going to use a round and get some clean water. Got my paper towel. So I'll use some blue. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just using a round brush, adding some water into the gouache, just kind of pulling it down to make like a wash consistency or like watercolor. Then I'm going to just sketch. You can sketch with pencil with gouache if you want to, because you can fully cover it in the end. But I'm going to go ahead and just use my paintbrush. So if it's not perfectly a sphere, that's totally fine. The other thing I wanted to mention, gouache, unlike watercolor where you use the white of the paper, gouache, you use actual white. So I'll use actual white and actual black with the blue for my highlights and my shadows. So I just need to find my black a minute. Oh. So I'm going to start by just filling in this full area with a wash. Basically like setting a middle value for this whole sphere. And you don't have to start off this washy. This is pretty light straight off the bat. You certainly don't need to start off this light. You could start off more opaque, because that's the advantage of gouache, is you can do that. I just happen to like to begin with more transparent washes. I paint this way with acrylic as well, and oil, where I begin with washes and build up my layers. Just gouache is a little bit different because we can use this first layer into our next layers. So just painting a nice circle, getting an even tone throughout. Of course, thinking about where your light source might be. So I sometimes like to just illustrate that with a little classic sunshine, like the light was coming down in this direction. That can be helpful. So I'm going to put some white on my palette, and I'm going to put some black on my palette. You can also darken with the complement, which in Blue's case would be orange. But I'm just gonna go classic white and black. You can also bring multiple colors into this too, but again, when you're beginning, I think it's best to keep things simple. And once you feel successful at the simple things, then it's you have the confidence to, you know, step it up a little bit. Okay, so again, we're gonna work for the highlight to a mid-tone to a core shadow. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of that blue. Just gonna move it over so I've got a little bit more room. I'll scooch this so you guys can see it. Just wanna make sure everything's on my screen. Sometimes it's nice to see the palette, the mixing too. But so I scooched it over here just so I'm not getting into the red and the yellow. So that's the only reason I moved it over. So I'm going to just start bringing in another layer. This time my brush is still wet, but it's not as wet this time. So I'm just going to bring in a little bit more of the color, the pure color, and I have not mixed any black or white into it yet. And again, I'm just kind of re-wetting my brush just to help move the paint a little bit. Because gouache is activated by water, you're typically going to want a little bit of water on your brush. It's just you want to play around with how much water. That's why if I have too much, I like to just kind of take my brush, I'll just roll it like this on the paper towel and just do like that, and it'll help me get rid of the water. So you just kind of get a feel for that too. So I just try to watch my edges a little bit just to keep them nice and clean. So this too, I just want to clean this off a little bit. I've got a little bit of paint on the handle a little bit. I just don't want it mixing. Okay, so with the gouache, one nice thing I can do here is I can just kind of take this clean brush, it's a little damp, and I can just kind of move the paint around that's already here. So if it didn't dry how I wanted it to, I just kind of at this point take my brush, dip it in water, clean it off, and then you can just kind of like rework it a little bit. So this will help you get like the initial kind of shape right. It allows you to take your time. Because you could get up, walk away, go take a break, and you could let this totally dry on the paper, and you could come back and you could still do this. Okay, so of course I'm going to add actual white onto here, so I'm not going to play around with this too much, but I just wanted to show you how you could move that around. Because you can leave this watercolor consistency if you want to. Again, that's one of the things about gouache, is it's versatile and how it can look. So now I'm gonna start putting in the shadow, the core shadow down here. So I'm gonna pull a little bit of the blue and start bringing some black into it. Now black gouache is pretty powerful. You don't need much. A little goes a long way. Again, just because it's so opaque. So sometimes you might need to mix a few little versions, or take what you mixed, pull some more blue, add your mixture to that. So just, you can kind of play around with it a little bit. And you can always, of course, you know, come to the side and lay down the color and see if you like what it looks like too before you apply it onto your actual form. So then I'll start to bring this darker tone down into here a little bit. And the nice thing with gouache is you don't have to put a ton on your brush. You can just kind of put a little bit on. And then I'll do that same kind of thing where I clean my brush off, dry it off a little bit, and I can kind of pull what's here around a little bit and you know, kind of manipulate it, move it, take my time with it, make sure it's looking how I want it to look. If it does dry on me, just, you know, dip your brush in water again and you can start pulling the paint around to activate it. And again, I just tend to like to paint where I start with washes and build up the opacity from there, but you can start off very opaque straight off the bat. And I can kind of show you some of that too in just a minute. Okay, so I'm going to kind of let this sit for a second, and while that's sitting, I'm going to take some of the white and kind of work in a little bit of a highlight. I'm going to start pulling some of the color up here. Again, this is why I like my paper towel, just kind of dry my brush and then continue to pull the paint around. Dry off my brush a little bit, kind of pull the paint around. Dry it off, go back in, pull the paint around. So you can kind of just mess with it as much as you want to, which is why it's really nice. Let's see, grab some more. Go into the highlight. And gouache dries pretty quickly. So if you do want to paint something on top, you can let it dry and then just use a lot less water on your brush and it'll sit on top pretty nicely, which I'll show you in just a minute. I can continue to lighten this up a little bit. So now I'm just using a little bit less water on my brush. And then coming into up here, I can just clean my brush off and just come back and start blending this. And again, the key is just to kind of keep wiping your brush off. So I keep wiping my brush off in between. I kind of ignored my light source a little bit. To be true, my highlight should be more over here. I'm getting a little bit more excited about the blending and not paying attention. Pull in a little bit darker value down here. But you can kind of keep working this and keep adding layers and building up the opacity and finishing, you know, the different forms. So I think forms, again, are always a good thing to play around with and to start with, because once you get down a basic form, forms translate into most anything else we'd want to paint, you know, most inanimate objects and you know, even people and faces can be broken down into forms. Like our nose essentially is a dimensional form on our face. So once you start to practice these and get a feel for them, I think that's it's a nice thing to do. But again, the gouache is really nice and versatile because you can keep playing around with it and keep, you know, manipulating it until you're getting it how you want it to look. And I can even take my little bit of white down here and pull in a little bit of the reflected light at the bottom. But yeah, I'm just always like cleaning my brush off with gouache is a good way to describe it, just because if you don't, the colors will start to get muddy. So if you keep your brush nice and clean, it blends just really nicely. And then of course I can put in a cast shadow. You could add in a background. I could continue to, you know, push these values for sure. Sometimes it is nice to just let it dry for a little bit and then come back and add more layers onto it. So that's traditionally how you would build something up with gouache and start to build up layers, is you'd start with very thin washes and then build up from there. But actually just with this, these couple swatches, I'll show you a couple things too. Yeah, zoom in. So because this dried really nice opaque, this is like one layer of gouache right here. Okay, one single layer, and it's really, it's very opaque. It might be hard to see on the screen, but again, that was from this jar. So with a really clean brush, my water unfortunately is a little tinted at this point in time. I probably rinse my water off with gouache like more than any other paint, just because you're always in your water cleaning stuff off, so it gets dirty pretty quick. So remember, keep your water clean is going to keep your colors nice and pure. But I just want to show you what you can do with gouache. You can do a single layer of opaque color. And I mean, this red's not super duper light. It's, you know, maybe a medium value. But I could take, let's say I've got some yellow. So I'm just kind of, I'll scooch over my palette so you can see a little bit. So I've just got some yellow that's straight from the tube, and I'm just kind of taking it and just mixing it into a nice even consistency. I just want it to be predictable, so when I pull from this pile, it's all even. Because keep that in mind, sometimes when you have a little area that's more washy, an area that's thick, if you're pulling from different areas of that, it's not predictable. You don't know what your paint's going to look like. So sometimes you just want to take it, and you could use a little palette knife for this too, but usually gouache, I'll just mix it with my brush. So mixing it all up so it's one nice even consistency with a little bit of water. Okay, this is almost like kind of what you're getting in the jar a little bit, because that keeping it in the jar keeps it that same consistency. So with this now, I'm just gonna kind of clean off my brush because it's so, I don't want so much paint on my brush. So I'm just going to clean that off a little bit. I really just need it kind of on the tip of my brush. And I'll just kind of paint some little lines, but you can take one single layer of paint, pretty much, and it's going to sit on top of that bottom color. So you can paint designs, but again, the key here is you can't have too much water in your brush. Okay, so I mixed the paint up so it was all ready to go ahead of time, but I don't want too much water in my brush, because if I've got a lot of water in my brush, that's going to pull up and activate what's underneath. So just to show you, if I put a lot of water in my brush and I paint with any kind of force, that's just going to reactivate the color underneath and start to mix. Okay, so lots of force, lots of water is going to reactivate and cause it to mix. But if you're very light and kind of intentional with the consistency of paint and the water, you can put nice light colors on top of darker colors. Whereas watercolor, it's sort of the opposite. You can really only do dark on top of light, but here you can go opposite. So even taking, here, this, I'll take some white. My white will be a little tinted just because of my water. Kind of like a yellowy white now, but that's okay. But even just, okay, so this is on that wash. So this is some white, same kind of thing. It's going to show up white on top. Just one layer of paint will show up nice and opaque. So that's kind of, you're getting more of the sense of acrylic when you're able to do dark on light and light on dark, because you can do that with acrylic paint. So that's kind of where gouache and gouache is a little bit watercolor, a little bit acrylic in that sense. You can also, with your gouache, paint it very thickly too. So I'll take just some of my red I have here, but you can take it and apply. I mean, you're not going to get full impasto like you can with like oil or acrylic, but you can sort of start to build up some texture. I'll just kind of layer a little blue in here too. I'll lift this up a little bit so you can see it, but you can, you know, build it up. So straight from the tube, you can see, you know, it can have a thickness to it as well, in addition to the sort of wash effect that you get with gouache. So those are some of the advantages and things you can do. So, I mean, gouache is really, really fun to play around with. It's, to be honest, probably one of my favorite mediums to use, just because it's so versatile, and I like that I can walk away from it, I can let things dry, but yet I can come back to it and play around with it. I have a little, let's see, here's a finished gouache painting. So these are some little succulents. This was a class we did a while back that I sort of ended up finishing. My paper ended up ripping a little bit, but you know, this was, I started with kind of washed layers, and then when I'm finishing, you know, it's more paint kind of straight from the tube. So beginning with washes and sort of finishing with less water and more paint straight from the tube is how I would describe the process. But then again, you can do things like this where you're just doing one layer and then where it's very opaque and sort of building on top. So there's just different things you can do, different effects that you can get with gouache that, you know, I think make it really fun. But I'm curious, I would love to hear from like Susan and Lee a little bit too, based on what you ladies have learned. I don't know if you want to share, hold up your paintings at all, or share anything you've done, but I think it's good to hear from, like I said, other people.
One of the things that I have found hardest in working with gouache is blending colors, which for me is so easy in watercolor. I'm having trouble with hearing today, I'm sorry. Hang on a second. Some days I'm ever deafer than others.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it changes daily. So today I was trying with this circle to get it a little more blended. So that's, for me, that's an improvement. And that was going back with a wet brush, and then a couple of times letting it dry and then going back again. So that's a little smoother transition in color than I've been able to do before. One of the other things I like about gouache is doing dry brush with it, because you get some nice textures.
Yes.
And then this one is gouache. And
that turned out really, really cool, by the way. I love how it came out. The colors are awesome.
Well, and then it's the gouache is the bright color, and then I went back with pastel. But the one I really love in gouache is this one.
Oh yeah.
And I think it really uses the medium well.
Yes.
It gives me really good opaque dark colors, and then I layered and layered and layered to get the different color effects I wanted. And then and then it's a real thin and washy here. This is really watered out, so I get almost a watercolor effect. So the more I play with gouache, the better I like it. You know,
you got some texture with it too.
Yeah, Susan, I would say that I agree with what you said, how that piece that you just held up like really captures the essence of gouache. How you've got those areas of washes, you've got the texture, you've got the opacity.
And I've got some impasto, and particularly in the lighting's bad, but it's really thick here. and you
Yes.
can feel it.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, that's great.
that is. The one that I was working on and I haven't finished, I'll just put up the picture. This is the one that we were working from.
Yeah, that picture.
Oh,
Yeah.
and I just love this. And
Me
then
too.
this
I love that one.
that I was working on, but I haven't finished yet. But I really enjoyed doing it, especially, you know, with the blocking in and then doing the layers like you were talking, Jen.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I like about gouache is that if you don't like the way you put it on, if you don't like the color, you can lift it off. Which is
Yes.
really nice.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm glad you mentioned lifting. Yes.
Yes.
That's good.
And I had done one on wood, like you were mentioning, on a slice of wood, and that was nice. The lifting off was nice because it was the face of the raccoon face, and there were times where I just want to put it down, and I just didn't like it, so I was able to pull it up,
Yes.
you know, with a wet brush.
Yes.
Did you use a brush, or did you dampen it and lift it with paper towel, or how did you do it?
I did both. I did both.
What?
I did both. Yeah,
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's great. I would say with lifting, so if you're curious about what lifting is, lifting up would just be removing an area of paint that you don't want there anymore. Unfortunately, like my water is crazy dirty. I would never like lift with water that looked like either of my cups of water right now. I always recommend really clean water, clean brush, or you could do a little bit of paper towel or even a clean little sponge. Dip it in the water, and if you kind of blot it on the paper or gently pull, you can lift up the color. You may get a little bit of a stain. Lee, did you see that there might be a little stain under where you lifted?
Yes.
Yeah. So it might stain a little bit, but the advantage, of course, because gouache is so opaque, is you can cover that back up with, you know, a different color or make it more opaque. But even like this right now, so this is dried for a minute. So just, I could go back into this, for example, because that's not, you know, blended how I would actually like it to be blended. But again, my water is pretty dirty, so I don't know how good it's gonna look. That's another thing, like clean water, clean brush, like all that's going to impact how stuff looks, you know. That's some of that stuff I didn't realize until, you know, I got a little bit further along in my art practice. I would just sit there and use dirty water, you know. But then you're like, oh, why are my colors muddy? Oh, that's because my water is really gross. So I learned that that's just one of the best things you can do. But like I could come in here with water or more paint really at this point. It just depends what I want to do. If I want more layers on it or if I want to blend what's already there. You know, I could even bring in a little bit of a cast shadow.
Oh yeah.
I'll show you that. And again, gouache, I'll typically draw first. Gouache and acrylic, and even oil, I typically like to sketch first. Watercolor is the one medium where I often, even watercolor, I take that back. I do sketch sometimes, but I just keep it crazy light. But gouache is nice because you can, like I mentioned earlier, you can cover up those lines. So if you're not comfortable with sketching with your paintbrush, don't feel like you need to. I can put in a little cast shadow. Yeah, it's funny. I don't know. I guess I started painting everything kind of like it was watercolor. Maybe that was to conserve my paint when I was, you know, a poor college student. But I really learned that, kind of like Lee was saying, I like to build up my layers. I feel like it just gives me control over what I'm painting. But then also, I feel like you can achieve more depth that way. Depending on what you're wanting to paint. I love this shadow. Got a little funky on me, but that's okay.
You can always lift it up.
I could lift it up, just not with this water.
No.
You guys want to see a big muddy mess? I can show you what not to do. Sometimes that's also effective. But yeah, this angle is a little funky. I would fix that, but that's okay. Like I said, it's we're just playing around. I mean, and I honestly think that's the best thing you can do with a new medium is just like, don't be afraid to just play around. So if I put like a really dark piece in and I don't want it so dark, I can take that color and I can spread it out a little bit. Sometimes when you lay gouache down, you're like, oh my goodness, like what did I just do? But you can manipulate it. Mm-hmm. Whereas like acrylic, I think the technique is you need to like let it dry and paint over it. Yeah. Whereas gouache, you are kind of reworking it with clean water in your brush. And also what Susan said about the dry brush too. I'm so glad that she mentioned that. That's a great technique. And that's just where you're using, you know, different brushes are going to look differently, but that's where you're like really drying your brush off. Let's see if I've got one that can work. But I've got this one. Okay, this is like an old brush. I think I've had this since probably high school, to be honest with you, and here it still is. And it's dried out. This was back when I was not a good caretaker of paintbrushes. I'm so much better now, but this brush can still serve a purpose in that it can provide some neat dry brush texture. Sometimes when you've got bits of dried paint in there, it ends up being kind of cool. So if I take a dry paintbrush and, you know, paint obviously has to have a bit of water in it because I've got to push it just a bit, but I could take this dry paintbrush, I'm going to mix this around a little bit, and I can get some interesting textures, which can be really fun for different things. You know, maybe I even want to dry brush a little texture on this. I don't know, that might be kind of interesting. Or I could kind of tap maybe my brush. So, you know, often when we're painting, we think about strokes, right? We're painting these strokes, but not always. Sometimes we need to tap, or we lift, or we push water around. You know, we're doing different things when we paint. So, you know, I don't know, it can be kind of interesting to maybe bring in another color into the mix. But yeah, trying different paint brushes, or maybe then taking that same brush and putting a little bit of water in it, you know, to see kind of what that looks like can be interesting. I mean, you can try layering the paint, some more washes. You know, mixing the paint on your paper can be interesting with gouache because it does reactivate. So sometimes you want that to happen. You know, that's not a bad thing about gouache that does it. It can be a good thing. It's frustrating sometimes when you're getting the hang of it, but once you get the hang of it, you start to realize, ooh, like when I start to pull up underneath color, it creates this neat blend that I wouldn't get with dry acrylic on dry acrylic, because that's not going to mix. But if I kind of take, or sorry, wet acrylic on dry acrylic, but if I take wet gouache on dry gouache, I can still kind of mix those underneath colors. So sometimes that creates just a neat thing. I don't know, I'm just kind of using these random colors I've got on my palette, kind of going neutral. I mix some yellow and purple together, but you know, you can kind of get the idea. So I think playing around, layering colors, trying different brush strokes, trying some of these techniques where you're layering light on dark or dark on light, trying different washes. I think definitely doing swatches of color. And then real quick, I'll just show you this, I'll just show you the jelly gouache too. Just do a little swipe of that so you can see what that looks like, because I showed you the other ones. Again, this was just on Amazon. But gouache too, I think it's a really good for on-the-go painting because you can reactivate it. So this is some that I can reactivate. So this has been dried out. So this is me mixing water into it. And that's the jelly gouache. So pretty close to the other. And then this black is still jellied. It's jelly consistency. It has not dried out. So this is almost looks like acrylic when I'm laying it down initially. But I bet if I took, like I said, if I took eyedroppers and just dropped water in each of these, it would turn back into jelly consistency kind of, I bet, in these little containers. But, you know, I can still water this down and do washes with it too. But yeah, so that's a little bit about gouache. So, you know, we've got a little bit of time left. So just, you know, wanted to open it up too if anyone has any questions about gouache or things you're wondering about it. Yeah.
So you recommend 140-pound paper or wood. How about masonite and not canvas, correct?
You can paint on canvas with gouache. You could. It should sit on canvas. I guess the reason I never did is because I kind of like a smoother surface for gouache, I guess. But if you wanted to bring out that texture, you could. I just personally have never tried it, but it should adhere to it. And then the masonite should work. You could gesso it first, or you could sand it, or you could just you could put layers on. Because the only thing about masonite is because it's a little bit darker of a wood, the color is just not going to be as vibrant straight off the bat. So you might need more coats. Whereas if you use, I don't even have any of the wood panels I normally use, but it's almost like a birchish color, I want to say. Maybe not as light as that, but it's a lighter kind of wood that I traditionally paint on. And I bought them from Arteza and Michaels, and they say they're like wood panels for painting. But you could also go to Home Depot or Lowe's and also buy like the nice smooth like pine from there, give it a little sand, and you could paint on that too.
You put a base coat on it or not?
You can put a base coat on it if you want. The panels you get seem to have a light treatment over them, but I'm not sure what that treatment is. Whereas if you get wood directly from, say, Home Depot, what I've noticed is your first wash just kind of absorbs into the wood slightly, but then after that, your next layers sit on top of that one that goes into the wood. And then when you seal it with a spray, which just to show you some of the sprays, I've got like a clear polyurethane that I've used before, just Krylon. This can work. And I've also got an acrylic. Yeah, this one I really love. Minwax Polycrylic. Protective finish, crystal clear finish in clear matte. I like this one because it keeps the matteness of the gouache, but you can seal gouache with a gloss spray if you'd like a sheen or a shine on it when you were done with it. But this one is really nice. I bought this, I believe, at Lowe's.
Thank
you.
And
then this one actually, this has a Hobby Lobby price tag on it. So this came from Hobby Lobby apparently at one point in time. So yeah, and then other mediums, I have a student right now, actually, she has a skateboard an unfinished skateboard, and she's painting gouache on that and is sealing it. So yeah, there's lots of things you can do with it that it can adhere to. You just got to plan on sealing it. If you don't seal it, you could dump water on it, it gets wet, and poof, you've messed up your art, which could be really heartbreaking.
Yeah, that's all you need.
Yes.
Yeah.
I really do want to try some of the acrylic gouache though. I just personally have never tried any, so I think that's next on my list, because I just like to kind of see how that finishes. But then again, I'm wondering if you're not going to get the advantage of the being able to re-wet and mix the way you can with traditional gouache. But I could see where it'd be nice because you get the matte finish. So, but I don't know, I might Classic Gouache seems like it's where it's at. I don't mind spraying it.
I think Arteza has an acrylic gouache as well. So
yeah.
Place to start.
Yeah, it's a place to start. I might try that. Oh, and I want to share with everybody too, actually, while I have you, about cleaning oil brushes. I found a new way.
Oh.
An alternative that I just learned about. That if you use like a bar soap, like Dial soap, and you take the brushes with oil paint, wipe them on rags or paper towels first, then suds up the soap and just put the soap on the brush. It'll break down like the compounds in the oil paint and allow you to then wash it with water.
Huh, no kidding.
So yeah, I tried it and the brushes worked great. You could also use the brush cleaner. The brush cleaner I really love. Here, I think I've got a picture of it. It's really good stuff. It's called B&J the Masters Brush Cleaner. It looks like this. It's a picture on my phone of it. I ordered it on Amazon, but it's great. You can use it for oil, watercolor, acrylic, and it helps get stains out. Oh, and it smells really good, like a citrusy, clean smell, which I really like. So I keep it by my my kitchen sink. So yeah, that's what I found out about oil, and an additional way to clean your brushes. So worth a try. I just got like a little container and put a bar of Dial soap in there. And then that's my brush soap.
I love it.
Yeah, so you have to try it and let me know how it goes for you guys. But yeah, I just want to share that a minute. But if there's any other gouache questions, does anyone else have any questions about gouache or things you're wondering about?
I was going to ask if you can mix, if you want to use both watercolor and gouache in the same painting.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, a lot of people do. A lot of people like to start with watercolor and do like big washes and areas. Like imagine you're painting a landscape, okay? Like the sky is all watercolor, and then you come in with maybe, I don't know, birch trees, and you want those to be really bold. So those are in gouache or something. So that's a pretty common practice to use the two together. And in fact, I've done that, and I've probably even mixed watercolor and gouache actually together. I don't know if you're even really supposed to, but you know, when I was in high school too, I think I was just so experimental. I was like, let's just try it, because why not? So I would put watercolor on canvas and stain my canvas, and I'd mix media, this and that, collage things into it. I'd get out my sewing kit and sew things on my canvases. I mean, I would just like why not, you know, like who cares if it's not traditional, like it's art, like express yourself. So I think, you know, at the end of the day, it's like, just try it, but maybe try it on a separate piece of paper so you're not gonna ruin something that you really love. But yeah, like why not? I'm always like, well, what's the worst that could happen? So yeah. Any other gouache questions? We'll definitely do some more paintings, and like kind of like Lee was showing that painting we had worked on before. We'll do more like that, where we can kind of move through some steps and paint together in gouache and in watercolor, and we'll do some oil, acrylic. I always mention what paint I'm using, but always please, like, even if I'm like, oh, we're doing this painting in gouache, but you just have watercolor, still feel free to come along and paint in the paint that you've got. Or if you are like, I just don't want to do gouache today, I want to do oil, like come along and do oil. Like that's great too, because, you know, I think the point is to paint, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. But yeah, I mean, I have a couple minutes too, if anyone has any other questions. I just want to make sure I got your questions.
For Betty's class tomorrow, do we need different materials?
For Betty's class tomorrow, it is, you'll want the picture plane, the clear picture plane, and then the marker to draw on that with. And then you'll need the pens, like your just pencil, eraser, drawing paper. And I believe that's it for tomorrow. That's all you need. Because we're doing the hand one that you put underneath, and you'll draw the hand on the clear picture plane, and then we'll transfer that to the paper. And if you don't have like a full graphite stick or anything like that, you can just use like a soft graphite pencil and like a tissue and smudge that in the background if you don't have a full graphite stick.
Would Conte crayon or charcoal be okay too?
Honestly, I don't see why not. Like, I think charcoal could totally work for this, because the whole idea is like the subtractive erasing and then the additive for the highlights and values, and charcoal, and that would work great for that. Yeah, but I just that master supply list is on there, and then the when it talks about the window, like cutting the mat, you don't have to do that. You just need a ruler. Basically, you're just drawing the border. Her idea was if you have a template, you can just trace it real fast, but you don't have to make those mats. You can just, like, I was just taking my ruler and just drawing the size of the frame that she said it was when I did it. I figured that was just as easy as taking my X-Acto knife and making a little template. I don't know. But yeah, so that should be all you need. And then on Tuesday, I didn't put it on the calendar yet. I forgot to extend it, but we're going to go for 90 minutes on Tuesday instead of an hour. But if you have to leave at an hour, that's totally fine. It's flexible. Cool. Well, next Saturday, I will get a paint along painting set up. Does anyone have a theme that they're interested in? I mean, I think still lives, like Lee showed, are great to practice because they kind of are like a play on a form, a basic form. But we could do anything. Landscapes can be really fun. Does anyone have anything that they're feeling like they'd like to paint?
Kind of like still life, and then you can add whatever you want to the background of that.
Totally. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll pull a still life and I'll put up a reference image for next class that could be printed, or you can have it on your screen. Do you want to plan on, it'll be gouache. My plan will be a gouache painting, but if you would like to work in a different medium, or if you'd like to work in watercolor instead, that's totally fine. I'll kind of cater the instruction to whatever everybody has, so you're able to follow along. So yeah, we'll do a still life next week. We'll do some gouache, and yeah, be a good time.
Great.
Cool.
Jen,
All
could
right.
you also
See you
include
tomorrow.
what kind of brushes we need, because I don't have the supplies. So if you can just include what you're going to be using.
Sure, I'll include what I'm going to be using, but I can tell you right now, to start beginner gouache, all I recommend is having one round, one flat. This says a size 10 flat, and this is a size, I used it so much I like rubbed off the size.
Yeah,
I couldn't
they
find
rub
them
off.
separately. They only came in a packet, so it's like I've got lots of rounds, but now I have no flats. So yeah, okay.
Well, round is the most versatile. If you were gonna have one paintbrush, I would say it should be a round for gouache and watercolor.
Yeah.
Your secondary paintbrush is helpful to have a flat. But if you have a little multi-pack, that's great.
Well, it's not, no, they came in all rounds or all flats.
Oh.
So it was kind of like, I didn't want to have like $30 worth of brushes. So
totally.
I just got one pack.
If you have just a round, that's fine too.
That's
in fact, I could, are they rounds in different sizes or just one size of round?
Yeah.
Different size rounds?
Different sizes, yeah.
Okay. Well, you know what I'll do then? Next class, I'll only paint in rounds. We'll just do different size rounds.
Okay.
Sometimes I like to do that. Sometimes I like to only paint with one type of brush. Don't feel like you have to, everyone else needs to do that, but that would be fun. I'll just cater it to just a round, because that's a nice, I think that's a classic way to start. So we'll look at different size rounds. I'll paint with just rounds, but you guys paint with what you want.
That was good.
I had a watercolor instructor, and she liked really detailed paintings. And she took a class from an artist she really admired, and she was shocked when they walked in. He gave them a big canvas, and he gave them a brush like this size. And he said, one large flat, that was it, go for it. And she had to learn to paint in a much different style than she had before. Really enjoyed it. So
I love it. We should do that too. Everybody get yourself a big flat. That's like, well, that's the biggest I have in front of me. I've got bigger than that. But yeah, get a big flat. We could do a big painting with one brush, the whole painting. That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah, use it this way and use it this way and use it this way. And yeah.
That's how you grow is, I think, I posted this, I think Lee, we talked about this before, the Phil Hansen Embrace the Shake. It's a TED Talk that I posted on our Element3 homepage. I highly recommend watching that TED Talk. It's so good, but he talks all about limitations in art. Sometimes we're overwhelmed by all the choices we have, and so we don't know how to even choose, or we feel stuck. But when you give yourself a limitation, aka like Susan just said, use one big flat brush on this whole painting, that can open you up creatively and make you try things you would have never thought to even try. So yeah, things like that are awesome. Setting little limitations for yourself just to see how you problem solve with them. You grow a lot. But yeah, highly recommend that. It's called Embrace the Shake. Even if you just Google TED Talk, Embrace the Shake, it'll